This presentation is provided by BoardPack LLC for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. The opinions expressed by the presenters are their own and not necessarily those of BoardPack. On behalf of BoardPack, we welcome you to today's webinar. BoardPack has teamed up with Amazon's #1 best-selling author in board governance, Thomas Bakewell, and fundraising guru Carol Weisman to help educate boards on the latest industry trends. The Boardroom webinar series will focus on different topics each month through the end of 2015. I wanted to mention really quickly that BoardPack is a secure, affordable, and easy-to-use paperless board meeting solution. Users can access materials from the native iPad app or through a web browser on other devices. Private annotations, minutes builder, and unlimited document storage are a few highlights of what we have to offer. Before we jump into today's topic, let me tell you a little bit about today's speakers. Thomas Bakewell works to bring out the best your team has to offer. He is the author of the book, Claiming Your Place at the Boardroom Table. Over the past 30 years, Thomas Bakewell has advised and directed CEOs and presidents of large for-profit and nonprofit corporations. His vast board experience has made him a leader and go-to source in board governance. Carol Weisman, president of Board Builders, is an internationally known speaker, author, trainer, and consultant. Carol specializes in volunteerism, fundraising, and governance. Carol won a Telly Award for her PBS special, Building a Board with a Passion for Mission. Her board experience is vast, having served on 38 boards and served as president of 7. Carol and Tom, take it away.
Good morning, Carol Weisman. Tom here. How are you?
I'm great, Tom Bakewell. How are you?
All right. Help me out here. What are we talking about today?
We're talking about board assessment.
Well, that sounds like a riveting topic.
It is. It really is.
What can you tell me about it right from the get-go? Because I want these people to think and know we really know what we're talking about here.
Great. And here's my favorite quote. You can't manage what you don't measure. And what people do is they bring really smart people together, and then they don't tell them what they expect of them, and they don't measure if they're doing it well.
Are we talking about boards?
Yes, we're talking about boards.
As in the boardroom, as in corporate boards, not-for-profit boards, association boards, every board known to man or woman.
People want to do a good job, and yet they're not really sure what a good job is.
So how do you solve that problem? What do you do if you got a board and you want to improve the performance of the board?
Well, here are some of the reasons from Board Source about why to assess a board, and you can read yourself. But basically, it's to perform better. And so you want to have every hour spent in the boardroom maximized. You want to do strategic thinking, and you want to spend time on, quote, the right things.
Okay, so if we're in a boardroom and we have 4 items on the agenda, and 2 of them are $1 million projects or multi-million-dollar projects, and 2 of them are strategy, and 1 of them is properly reporting expense reports, you don't really want to spend 5 hours talking about expense reports.
People want to spend the time talking about expense reports if they don't have to be involved in fundraising.
Gotcha.
So sometimes
anything but talking about fundraising. Now you're talking about not-for-profit
nonprofits.
Yep.
So if they really, and that's what you find, Tom,
yep, is
that people talk about something other than the proverbial elephant in the room because they don't want to deal with the difficult stuff.
Yeah. So a purpose of a board assessment is to help people get a handle around what we're doing. So how would you, so they can improve their performance, but how would you evaluate a board? What's the way, what are the options out there? How does one go about evaluating a board?
Well, and there are many, many, many ways to do it, and we're going to discuss today some of the ways to do it. And one is a self-evaluation, and sometimes you bring in a consultant, and sometimes the paid leadership within the organization is involved in anything from a 360 evaluation to any other kind of models. There are lots of great models out there.
Okay, so I hear a slide here that says the cons. So did we skip the pros, or are we getting to those as well on board assessments?
Well, we're going to start with the cons because I personally have a real problem with board self-assessment. I worked with a board a number of years ago that was a $150 million a year nonprofit. Mm-hmm. They had an initiative that they spent $25 million on and managed to lose $30 million, which takes some creativity.
It's probably more common than we think.
Yeah, right. Yeah. At any rate, They did a self-assessment, and they all thought they were doing.
We did a
great
beautiful job. We spent $25 million, and we
Right.
lost 35 or 30.
Right, 30.
Okay. Very
And
good.
so here's one of the things that I didn't work on the self-assessment. I came in afterwards. And this is not always true, but some people always think they do a great job, and some people always think they do a lousy job. And what was interesting at that time, and this was about 15 years ago, is I took a look at the gender of the people who thought they were doing a great job and the people who thought they weren't doing an adequate
I
job.
bet I can guess the answer to this.
You bet you
The
can.
men thought they had done a great job, and
Yep.
the women were a little more transparent and honest.
Well, they may have been doing a good job,
Okay.
but they didn't think they were.
Okay.
And so there was no clear criteria of what it takes to do a good job.
So we're just talking here about self-assessment. So let me ask you a probing question. So you have a number of good reasons here of not to do self-assessment. It's kind of boiling down to the issue of it's really hard to look at ourselves honestly and clearly. So one of the things I want to ask you, though, is do you do a board assessment to fix a people problem or a person individual problem when there's a problem with a board member?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
This is
Why
not the
Yep.
time to do it. If you have a board member who is either underperforming or is just a major pain in the neck, which can happen,
Yeah.
then you have to deal with it immediately. You can't wait for a board assessment. You can evaluate to see if it's just you that's bothered.
Okay. So what you're saying is board assessments, or the words I would put on it, board assessments fundamentally are to help the organization perform better. They're not to fix a individual problem. And that actually goes to the dynamic of whether people want to be open and honest and transparent with an assessment, the trust level. Why would I want somebody to come assess me if it's going to be punitive?
Well, and I think the other phrase that I like is good governance does not cure crazy.
Okay.
And if you have somebody on your board who is unstable, and you can recruit people who do have problems with mental illness, this is way beyond what you can manage, and it needs to be dealt with.
Okay. So we have all kinds of issues going on here. So let's get into some of the details. So we're talking about a pro here on the next slide. Now, what's this about the pros of a self-assessment?
Well, this is really your world, and these are the for-profit requirements.
Yeah, especially the large public companies. The rules have changed dramatically in governance in the past decade, particularly with stock exchange listings and Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank, the alphabet soup of the new laws, the financial world and all. And one of the reasons you're seeing a dramatic increase in the number of board assessments, especially at public company levels, you like to think it's because it's good governance and it's the right thing to do. But most of the stock exchanges, even worldwide, are requiring their boards, especially on three committees, the Nom/Gov committee, the audit committee, and what some people might call the executive committee or other committees, that they have evaluations. They're actually required to have it. So that's kind of fueled the fire to do evaluations, and I believe that it's proving up to be a very productive process to have these evaluations.
And the big question is who decides what is an effective board.
Okay.
And it's very different for different kinds of boards. And one of the things the board source says, which I love, is if you've been on one board, you know one board.
Yeah, that's a great insight. You mentioned Board Source. So those who aren't in the know, Board Source is an organization that focuses on governance, and they have a sweet spot with not-for-profits. How would you describe them? Is that inaccurate?
Exactly.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and you say here, we show here on board effectiveness, if there's a problem, the board can and will be held accountable in either instance. So the point being there, I do believe that if there's a problem on the board, it's just not one person's problem, it's the entire board's problem.
It's actually more like a family.
Yeah.
It's a system.
Yeah, it's a family system, and to perform well, the family has to be healthy overall.
Absolutely.
Good. Okay.
And here's the big issue. What do you want to measure?
Yeah. If you're going to do an self-assessment or evaluation, what are you really going to look at? Let me just dive in here for a minute. You don't have it here on the list, but just want to be clear with people. There's a lot of different types of evaluations, so we're going to talk about the different ways you can do evaluations. But you can also look at it from a very global point of view of what are we evaluating? Are we evaluating the board overall? Are we doing a individual director peer-to-peer evaluation? Are we doing an evaluation of our skills assessment? That is to say, do we have heavy finance? Do we have heavy fundraising? Do we have charming people? Do we have attractive people? I'm being a little humorous there, but what do we have in the way of talent? Big thing today is to have people who understand cybersecurity. There's a big demand
Sure.
for that talent now. You can do reviews of the individual committees, so there's all kinds of assessments you could have. We're talking about general assessments overall of the board overall, an evaluation or a self-assessment. So tell me more.
Well, and this is what the National Association for Corporate Directors say. And I think they've really nailed it. Having the right people, the right culture. And culture is something that is frequently left out. Mm-hmm. So one of the things about a great board, a truly great board, is when people can respectfully disagree.
Right. Yeah, no, that's an essence of a good board is to be able to, it's what I call the ability to stand alone and disagree agreeably.
Yes.
Yeah, without getting in a huff, you have to be able to forcefully and not even forcefully, you have to be able to with a clear mind, state your position if there's something going on. You've got to have the temerity and the courage to say, y'all, that's a beautiful idea, but here's why I disagree.
Yes. And the right information is really important because I think sometimes, especially with founder boards in the nonprofit world, you get everybody who agrees with you that this should be happening.
Gotcha.
And you don't have any contrarians in the board who may, and I'll give you an example. I worked with a food pantry years ago, and they created this spectacular, it was both a training site for people who were going to learn how to work in the food industry, and as well as a place for people who are homeless to get foods.
So from a corporate point of view, they were well integrated.
Absolutely. They had people from the Restaurant Association, and that's where it came out of. The only thing they didn't have was anybody in the room that knew anything about homelessness. And the problem was, it wasn't on a bus line.
So they weren't connecting to people. They weren't getting, they had all kinds of talent and skill and resources, but they didn't have the customers they needed.
Right. Well, they didn't have the right people in the room because they didn't have the right information. They had people with great hearts who were willing to do great things, but they didn't have the information that homeless people cannot get to a food pantry unless it's on a bus line.
Yeah, and this makes me think of one of the current trends that's going on with a lot of boards today, and you work for so many of them. The trend forever, I'll disagree a bit on this one, but the trend forever has been if we have a large not-for-profit board, we want all the CEOs, or even on the corporate board it used to be, we want all the CEOs. And that trend's shifted a lot.
Yes.
You don't have just CEOs and boards today, do you?
Absolutely.
Yeah, gotcha. So how can a board assessment be used? Give us some thoughts about just the practicality. You're thinking about doing a board assessment. Your CEO or your board chair calls you. What kinds of things do you talk about?
Well, most of all, what do you want to measure? So do we think we have a problem?
Right.
And if it even smells slightly off,
Yeah.
let's take a look at it.
Okay.
So it's sort of like if I have a toothache, I'm not going to go to my cardiologist.
Right.
I'm going to take a look. I'm going to go to my dentist.
Okay.
And so you find the right person for the right systems problem. So if people seem confused about the program or the product or whatever seems to be going on, that's what you want to delve into. And that's the not fun part because that's
Getting down to it and dealing with the issue.
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And here's the big trick is that you don't have a kumbaya assessment, meaning, oh, we found out what's wrong.
Okay.
Oh, we're so glad. And then nobody does anything about it.
Okay. So if you're going to go to the trouble of assessment, you want to really do the homework and figure out what you need and how to do it. Here's one other comment I would add in terms of board assessments. One of the things I always look for on a board is goodness of fit.
Yes.
You've got a group of people that are going to work together. And let me give you just an example from the history, the books of history that we've lived through in the last decades. If you sat down and looked at a board like the poster child for bad governance, Enron.
Yes.
Enron had as blue chip a board as you can get. They checked all the boxes. They had all the talent. They had the major university business school dean. They had the giants of industry. They had genius people. And at the same time, they had one of the biggest debacles of history, and it didn't work together. So one of the things I always look for is goodness of fit among the board members, and is it a healthy culture, as you mentioned. So let's move on and talk about how would you choose a method to do a board assessment. Now, we got way too many words on this page, so just talk to me about doing a board assessment.
Well, there are several ways to do it, and one is the biggest issue is what you want to achieve. So if you want to achieve compliance, and that's
check the box.
Absolutely check the box. And sometimes
what does that mean, though? I mean,
this is when it's just
25 questionnaires.
Absolutely.
Do people show up for the meetings on time?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's quick and dirty.
Yeah.
And sometimes people have to do it because funders or oversight organizations like the SEC, the United Way, or whatever organization or funder,
They require it.
They require it. And sometimes it makes sense to do a very simple checklist, one and done. And
especially if it's the first time out.
First time out, also, if you're in the middle of something else really big, so if you're in the middle of a capital campaign,
Right. Yeah.
to spend hours and hours and hours when you should be in the middle of a capital campaign,
Right.
or in your world, if you're acquiring another company and you're going
A
to
merger and acquisition, the last thing the
absolutely.
board member wants to have their head wrapped around was taking the time to do a thoughtful evaluation.
Exactly. And there are years where you just do one and done, get it done, quickly done.
Now, I know you, and you always like using the medical metaphor, so this is probably also like going to see a doctor or a specialist.
This is just a simple physical, without the MRI, without the big time assessment.
But there are times that you want to go get the specialist and go much deeper.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that usually comes out of pain.
Okay.
And if there seems to be a problem, you want to go a whole lot deeper.
Okay.
And you want to bring someone in, and that outside thinker is really the one that can take a look at
so
it.
help me out here, though. Help the audience out. If you're going beyond a checklist, so one way to do an assessment is simply a great list of questions.
Sure.
And good questions are always very important. And they could be open-ended questions. But what's another way? Do you do interviews? You talk about having an outside facilitator come in. What's another way beyond just a checklist?
Absolutely. And we're going to talk about what good questions look like.
Okay, good.
And if you want the biggest ROI, your return on investment, but have limited time or money, you can use a survey, but you have to make sure there's trust involved. Any kind of board assessment involves trust.
Okay. So we'll talk on establishing trust as we go through the rest of these slides here.
And what I like is the idea of doing a different process different years.
Okay, so you alternate the process so people don't get bored with it, or I've had client situations in the past where the organization maybe has an issue in the board, and the first thing they say is, oh yeah, well, we've done evaluations, and they whip it out, and there is an evaluation form where it's the same check-the-box form that they've used for a decade every year in a row.
Right.
And they've gotten no real response or no real information that's valuable or tells the organization a whole lot more other than that standard checklist.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Now, when you're thinking about doing a board evaluation or a board assessment, we have a slide here that talks about areas of consideration. So tell me what we're thinking of here.
Well, really, and you alluded to it with Enron. Do we have the right people in the room?
Okay.
And they can look like the right people.
Right.
And they can have all the right credentials, but it still is not the right group.
Okay.
And that's frequently because they are all thinking the same way.
Sure. So what you really, culture gets into a whole wide range of things like social dynamics, et cetera.
Yes.
And we talk here about composition and leadership, so that's what the board looks like. Refreshment mechanisms, what's that referring to? Well, here's what that's referring to, Carol. I'm going to answer my own question.
I love it.
That's how do you refresh a board? When's it time to move people out?
Yes.
So I worked with a board not too long ago that had an interesting history. They were a very large organization in the healthcare space, and they had a battle with a regulator. And unbelievable, they won the battle with the regulator. And so this board was very proud of themselves. They should have been, and they They had a bond, a kindred spirit. They had fought the good fight, and they were going to, be the band of brothers and sisters forever. That was the good news. The bad news was, about a decade later, they hadn't changed, and they hadn't added anybody new, and they hadn't refreshed themselves.
Yes.
So the question becomes, how often should you refresh board members? How often do you bring new people on? How much do you turn over? That's what we mean by refreshment mechanisms. What kind of search process do you have? How do you bring new board members on? And one way to kick off a good overview is to have an evaluation or assessment of your board.
And I think also in the nonprofit arena, sometimes you need to pause after a big battle and regroup. So it may be after a huge capital campaign. It may be after a CEO search. So that even if you keep the same people in the room, that you need to have something where you stop and celebrate, because it is a marathon, it's not a sprint.
Good. And let's talk about tips for an effective evaluation. How does one do an effective evaluation?
Well, for one thing, you have to trust whoever is going to be involved.
Okay.
So you have to delegate the authority.
All right. So let's talk about the trust piece. So when I do an evaluation, now you and I, let's do a major overview here quickly. So one way to do an evaluation or assessment is check the list. Another way would be outright 100% surveys. Simply, when I say survey, almost an interview where you're talking to the board members. You could do a combination. You could do, one of the approaches I use is I do a simple a list of questions with open-ended questions. So it might be a tight question like, the board is performing well, and can you give examples? Or I might say, what are the top 3 things the board achieved this year, or what are the 3 goals we ought to achieve next year? So some real open-ended questions. And then you would take that, but one of the things I do to get to the trust point right up front is I be very clear with everybody that on the interviews that they're confidential, and the information will only be fed back as a group and not on the individual if we're doing an overall board evaluation. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And if there's something that is really startling, I will ask the person, may I share this? And frequently they'll say, I've been saying this for a decade. You forever. Bet. Okay. And when you report this, they'll know who it is. You also have to define the objective. So what are we looking at?
We're not looking to move a bad player off the board or somebody who talks too much.
No. Okay. And you have to select the tool. Time is money in some situations. And if you're going to do extensive interviewing, it's both the time of the board member, and you have to pay for someone to do the interviews.
So to be a little more specific, you could go online, and we're not going to drop any brand names here or anything, but if you popped up board assessments or board evaluation, you would probably find a dozen good, simple instruments with organizations, associations, organizations. Board Source probably has one there. I dropped the name. I said I wasn't going to. Where you could get a good instrument, pretty simple process. But then the other extreme, you talked about using consultants or associations or someone like the National Association of Corporate Directors there. I dropped the other name. They have processes, and you can get proposals, and so it's anywhere from very simple instruments that are very thrifty and cost-effective to very expensive processes where you create what you want to have done, and you hire top talent to do it. Okay.
Absolutely, and I think you need to do that every few years. That's not a yearly thing.
That being invest the money to really have a top pro. Because, look, we have a firm belief here, and the firm belief is when you talk to people and get honest with people, they're probably going to tell you the truth. If it's in a confidential, trusting manner. Okay?
And
so here's the summary of that, what we just talked about. In a tight, no bullet points, but 3 little topics. You can do the written surveys or reports. You can do interviews, or you can have a facilitated discussion. This is where you get everybody in a room or a small group of people in the room, and you lead a discussion about, maybe let's talk about what's really going on. Let's talk about what you want to talk about. Let's talk about, is our board really performing? Is it not? Facilitated discussion.
When I do a facilitated discussion, there's always 4 groups I want to talk to before I walk in the room.
All right, enlighten us.
I want to talk to the current leaders, current board leaders, staff, emerging leaders, and stinkers. And sometimes there are a lot of stinkers, and sometimes there are no stinkers.
All right, now a stinker says this as in deep thinkers, or what's a stinker?
No,
is
a
this
stinker
somebody who's a
is-
problem? Or?
Yes, someone who's a problem.
Okay.
And I
Give
remember
me an example. Yeah, come on.
I worked with one group, and it had been an orphanage and turned into it evolved into an organization that served very disturbed youth. So it was a completely different kind of operation. They needed nurses. It was 3-to-1 instead of 17-to-1 when it was an orphanage. This was a guy who had been at the orphanage and had done incredibly well. And he just kept saying, we used to do this. We used to do this.
So he grew up in the orphanage, and so he had a special bond.
Absolutely.
Yeah, gotcha.
And I called, and he was so disruptive in the meetings. Plus, he was in his late 70s, and there was a question about whether he might have
Little dementias, early onset.
Well, maybe not
Alzheimer's,
early
whatever.
onset.
Yeah, full blown.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I called him, and I said, because he was listed in the stinker category, and I called him, and I said, what are you most proud of? And he said that I grew up and did so well because I had been there. And I said, what do you see for the future of the children who are living there now? And it just stumped him. And he said, hopefully they'll be able to live independent lives and
which
stay
is a
out
big
of prison.
Versus being an overachiever and having a great life.
Yeah. And I said, what are your biggest frustrations? And he said, they don't listen to me when I talk about how it used to be. And I said, is the board the right place for that?
So he's taking a walk down memory lane, and people have heard it 100 times before, and
they don't listen. And I said, sometimes when people don't listen, it's because you're using the wrong form. And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, I wonder if you should be writing an autobiography or a memoir of what this place used to be instead of serving on the board, because it's a source of frustration. And he said, I love that idea.
Didn't you get a check out of him?
I didn't.
Come on, did you get a check out of him?
Not only did I get a check out of him.
Not for you, but for the organization.
Not only did he give a donation, but I got...
You got him off the board too, didn't you?
He left the board, and I got an extremely nice lunch from the CEO.
All right.
Because he didn't belong on the board. He belonged as the memory, and the memory was so far ago that it wasn't appropriate.
So he wasn't a good board member.
No.
An evaluation process by hook or by crook, you helped this organization move somebody off who really was not serving the board well, wasn't a good fit, and you made it a slam dunk because you got some money as well.
And he left as a friend.
Yeah, he left as a friend. Here's my expression. I've got one, and I'm going to use one of your favorite expressions, okay? Whenever there's challenges in an organization, what I always advise people is you want this to end well.
Yes.
Okay, so that ended well. And then I'm going to use the expression you use a lot of times, especially in the not-for-profit world. And you know what I'm getting ready to say here.
Know.
You like to whack them and plaque them.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So we celebrated what he'd done and got him off the board.
And you gave him a big plaque. Okay.
Absolutely. Here's what both Tom and I like. We like open-ended questions instead of lists. And so we'd rather ask a question, if you were going to add one new board member, what skill set or background would you want that person to have?
Yeah, absolutely.
And those open-ended questions, if you really want to deep dive,
right.
And this is the hairy questions. These are the courageous
questions. The hardball
questions.
questions, yes, okay.
These are the courageous questions. What do you think you've accomplished as a board member in the last year?
Exactly. What have I accomplished?
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
And that really stops them cold.
Yeah. And it makes the board member think about, am I doing my job or what should I be doing? Board slots are a privilege, and there's only a handful of them in the best boards. And you really need to bring great value to that board. Back to this issue of being refreshed, the other issue you get a lot of people that get on a board. Let's pick an example, a college board, or your example of the fellow on the orphanage board. That may have been the most important board to them in their life, but what the college needs today is somebody who, it's not an 800-student college anymore, it's a 20,000-student university today, and maybe they need somebody who's a lot more vital, a lot more visionary, has things that they can't bring to the table. And it takes honest conversation to deal with that.
And there can be real pain involved because, as you mentioned, your 5 guys, there become I have friends that have been my friends for 20 and 30 years because we served together. And it's probably the closest I'll ever get to the battlefield because I'm a coward, among other things. But you really feel like you've gone through the wars with someone and there's a real bond and they can stay friends forever. But that doesn't mean you stay on the board together forever.
And it doesn't mean you're being productive. Yeah,
No.
I got you. Okay.
And here's some of the approaches that we sort of alluded to.
We've talked around these. You do a quantitative, which is just to basically fill out the form survey. You can do a qualitative, which is the personal interviews. And you can also do kind of we talked about facilitation, the group self-assessment. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think
so
I
just
would
different
use,
language for the same processes.
absolutely, but I would use different methods, different years.
Okay.
Because some years you don't have the time for
Right.
an in-depth look.
Right.
And some years when you especially when you know that your board chair or your executive director or CEO are going to be leaving.
Right.
When you have that
Special moment in time. You know there's a big event coming for the organization.
exactly,
Yeah.
then you really have to dive deep.
Now, I want to use some technical governance language here. You just to follow on your conversation. You mentioned the concept of a executive succession or a director
Yes.
succession or a CEO succession. This also another language you could use for board evaluations or board assessment is director or trustee succession as well, and that's a topic that gets a lot of import today. It really needs attention because you need to think about how do we put together the best board that we need to have. You know, in the old days it used to be I have this friend and that friend, and today it really needs to be a different approach. And one of the ways to help you figure out what you need for a great board is to do a great evaluation.
And again, we've already alluded to this, but these open-ended questions make a huge difference. And I'm working with a board right now, and it's a fascinating little board. It's a very tiny nonprofit. And one of the questions I've asked them is, do you believe that you are producing a process or a product?
Tell me more.
And they're really struggling with this because if it's a product, in fact, it happens to be a book, then we can sell it as a book and we go a completely different route looking at museums and all sorts of things like that, that we put the book in. If it's a process of writing, then we make it into a curriculum. And they're really struggling. So that's the open-ended question. And because one is going to veer very far to one side versus the other. One, you're going to have to bring in people
Right.
that have curriculum development and have an in with the school districts. And the other is that you need someone who has a background in distributing books.
And it's you're thinking through what you really need on the board. Now let's look at the slide here. It also talks about, just in the title there, individual director evaluation. So you gave an assessment or an example there where you're kind of looking at the board overall. This, we simply want to point out also that a lot of times in evaluations you can look carefully at the individual and their performance. Again, it's always hard to look at an individual's assessment. It's always painful for us to do it, but there's always learning that goes with it. Some people have actually matured to the point where they like the individual assessment, so they can learn, am I doing what I need to do? And it's always...
It goes on the other side too.
Tell me.
One of my favorite questions to ask is the board using you effectively?
Great question. Great.
And I'll never forget being in a room where I said, and I just simply asked people, what are you good at? And one woman said, well, I'm really good at accounting. And this guy said,
I didn't know that.
oh, he was much worse than that.
What'd
He
he
said,
say?
what do you know about accounting? You're a second grade teacher.
And she said, yes, but...
Doesn't mean I wasn't a partner at Arthur Anderson.
Oh, my gosh.
Yes, she had been a partner at Arthur Anderson, gone back to school, found her passion, but she still knew more about accounting than anybody else.
Exactly. Okay, great insight. Okay, so here's a sample survey, and just a simple example of if a company was doing a valuation. This is where you could either evaluate each other individually, or you could look at what are the skills that we need. So this is a form that comes from the National Association of Corporate Directors. They have a board advisory service. Again, they are an organization that does lots of board assessments, among many, many other things in the governance space. And I work for them occasionally as a faculty member, as full disclosure. So here's a situation where you would say, take a simple survey. Again, it's check the forms or actually drop in the numbers. You might either on a scale of 1 to 5 or a 1 to 10 take this form and say, we need people with finance skills. Director number 1, I think their 1 to 5 is a 5. Number 2 is your little school teacher, who we now found out
Yes.
is a CPA. I was going to give her a 1, but now I'm going to give her a 5, etc. And what's very interesting is a lot of times when you get these numbers and you compare them, well, I rank myself as thinking I was a number 5 on finance, and guess what everybody else ranked me?
Yeah.
3, so there's a gap there. So what do you do? So this is just a good way to gather basic data. So you're either looking at what's the individual board member's skill set in terms of raw number, or what skills do we need? You could add a lot of skills to this list. So on this list here, obviously it's for-profit because it doesn't have fundraising.
Sure.
If you're doing a not-for-profit, you would want to know fundraising, and you could probably come up with 3 items related to fundraising.
Absolutely.
So just a sample template to look at, and let's move on here and talk about board values and goals overall.
Values is what it's all about.
Tell me more.
And what is really important to this organization, and what kind of organization, and some of this is getting into strategy,
Okay.
but what do we value? Do we value profit over everything? Do we value serving the least served, understanding the business model? So one of the challenges of senior executives,
Right.
whether you call them CEOs or executive directors, is when they sit down at their desk first thing in the morning, they have 100 pieces of data coming at them. One of the jobs of the board is to help them know which data to respond to first.
What are the priorities?
What are the priorities? And it has to match the values and goals.
Very neat.
So it can be very frustrating to be that person at the top and not have a clear idea of what is most important.
And a great evaluation, whether it's check the form or interviews or a group setting, can help you check and see if you're in alignment with what your values and stated values and goals are.
Absolutely.
Good. Okay. So let's talk about some just basic nuts and bolts of doing an evaluation. I see the word confidentiality up there. You want to handle that, or you want the lawyer to handle that?
Oh, I always want the lawyer to handle it.
Okay. Well, look, here's one of the key things about doing an evaluation, particularly if you're doing personal evaluations. You have the overall issue of trust, which Carol talked about, which is vitally important. The board members have to understand and trust the process. So again, the way that I do that is I tee it up so it's very clear understanding that the individual conversations with board members will be confidential, and that the information fed back will only be on a group setting or identified. Now, I always make 2 disclaimers on that. One you've already mentioned. One disclaimer is if somebody's really got a hot button, I ask their permission. May I share this? Okay.
And everybody knows.
Now, usually they do. And that was the other thing. This where I make a disclaimer. If somebody has a expression that everybody's heard 100 times, and you put that into your notes and feed that back in a group setting, everybody's going to know that it was Carol that said whack 'em and plack 'em or whatever
Well,
else.
and I worked with the board
Yeah.
one time, and it was actually hysterical because the one guy always used football analogies
Right.
because he used to be a coach.
So everybody knows.
Everybody knows.
Gotcha.
And so if it was, and I don't know anything about football, so I never knew what it was.
Right.
Once we're in the end zone, I go, what does that mean?
All right.
And so, anytime it was a football analogy, you knew it was a
You knew
football
it was him.
coach.
Okay. And here's the one other key thing on confidentiality. Let's talk about the ugly side of having lawyers in the world. I am one. Litigation. Particularly on, again, the public companies and
Yes.
the major issues. Let's just you talked about mergers and acquisitions. In this day and age, a acquisition of a public company being acquired or making an acquisition, 95% of the time there's going to be automatic litigation filed. Company being taken over, people are going to say I should have gotten a higher stock price
Sure.
or whatever else. When it comes time to do litigation, lots of times they can dig into things like, so let's say we've got somebody on the board that we don't think belongs there. Okay, we're a large shareholder. We want to complain
Sure.
about somebody. You might do litigation and say, give me a copy of the board evaluations. I want to prove
Sure.
that this person had an issue here or is not, getting high scores. So one of the things you want to do in a board evaluation is be aware of the confidentiality issues. When I do the work, I happen to be able to add the attorney-client privilege to it. And when I do a work, whether I'm just working as a consultant or have somebody working with me who's not a lawyer, we have an understanding that after 90 days and the report out, all the data will be disposed of.
Absolutely.
So, you deal with that. Okay, so here's an issue also, parameters to look at, the director commitment, the fiduciary duty, what kind of contribution is being made. Again, just kind of overall governance concepts. You're confirming the person's committed. You're making sure as part of the work that you honor all the fiduciary duties and are meeting those. An example of that might be an issue of confidentiality, not in terms of me doing a survey, but a board member and their confidentiality. So, for example, there have been very public cases, one a well-known company and being very respectful of the company, Hewlett-Packard, they had a board battle.
Yes.
And some of the board members were walking out the boardroom, and while they have a legal fiduciary duty to keep the matters in the boardroom private, they were leaking to the press. And there were big battles about who was leaking what. So you have to honor those. Let's move on to the next.
Well,
Yep.
I've got one more thing on that one. If I want to talk about contribution.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because contribution can be time or money.
Okay.
And I think you have to be very clear with people before they join the board what your expectations are.
What you expect for them, why they're being brought on the board.
Right. Yeah. And so sometimes what you expect from them is not going to work. Yeah. Because I'll give you an example. If you get someone from a major corporation, whether it's Boeing or whatever, Ralston Purina, we're in St. Louis, so those are two of our biggies. And your expectation is that you wind up getting a huge contribution from them. And you are not the kind of charity that they will ever give to.
You're spitting in the wind, excuse the casual expression.
Exactly. Yeah. And so you need to have that discussion. We want someone at Ralston because we're an arts organization. Now, if you're the Humane Society, boy, they are totally behind you. But they may or may not be interested in an arts organization. Right. So have that discussion beforehand, because if your expectation is that you're going to get big bucks from Ralston, that may not be reasonable.
And another example on contribution there is that what is the person expected to bring to the table? Maybe you're not bringing them there for fundraising. Maybe you're looking for somebody to get a little more organic here, who's a truth teller, somebody who can you've just been through a financial fraud crisis, and you're bringing somebody who's known for absolute integrity and is a partner of a major accounting firm with a good reputation. Gotcha. Okay. So let's talk about value behaviors for directors. Now, what do you have in mind with this?
Well, we're really talking about respecting, again, expertise and viewpoints, and making sure that people are prepared for meetings, that they're really doing their due diligence, that they're committing to the work and towards consensus.
So these are the values you're looking for directors to have so that the board as a whole can create a good culture and work well together.
And I think when the values aren't shared and when there's a disagreement, you have two choices. You can either go along with the decision, even if you think it's a bad one, or you can get out. But you cannot keep griping.
Okay. So what you're saying is that's bad behavior, just be a broken record and just to complain about something all the time, like your example of the fella with the orphanage. The organization had changed, he didn't, and he didn't really fit that board anymore.
Well, and an even better example is one group was going to have this initiative, and one board member said, I don't think this is going to work, and this is why, and everybody voted him down. And then in the end, he was right. And he could not, nobody would say, you were right, because he was so obnoxious about it. But he was right, and he needed to be recognized so he could move on.
So he could move on, absolutely. Okay. So we got this long list of behaviors, and there are things that we look like from everybody, protecting confidentiality and all. Let's talk about the stages of possibly implementing a board assessment here. And let me just touch for a moment on what I mean by this. If you're starting to do something like individual board reviews in detail, individual director reviews, sometimes that can be a very delicate topic, and people are afraid of that. Board members are afraid of that. So one way to ease into that is to go through stages. So you could have it in a situation where when you do personal reviews, all you do is review it with the chairman of the board, or all you do is share it with the individual. So the first year out, we're going to go through this process, see how it goes, let people get comfortable, let them build the trust to see that this isn't the hangman's noose coming out on anybody. This is simply a genuine, bona fide, trusting process to help us all improve our skill set. So that's what we mean by the stages here. You encourage, you have peer review, again, other people commenting in the boardroom on you. You may think I have great insights and comments, and what they may say is, Tom, he really talks too much.
And again, here's some of the kinds of evaluations that are used.
Yeah. So, and just data. Private companies, about 60% of them do board reviews, and there's the types: full board, individuals, committees, etc. Moving on, here's the same data for public. Now, this is recent data, but again, a decade ago, full board reviews were done at about 30% of the public company boards. Now it's up pushing 90. I think if we did a current survey right now, it would be over 90%. And again, the stock exchanges are requiring this, so you've got the last kind of cycle of boards that aren't doing it picking up now. So this will approach 100% in the very near future. And here's questions to ask yourself. What are they, Carol?
If you're successful, what will you know?
Mm-hmm.
Is it measurable?
Yeah.
And what will you do to improve? And I think one of the things that scares nonprofit boards, and this is very frightening, is if you find that people are underperforming and you don't have a long line of people who want to serve on your board, in fact, there may have been some arm twisting to get people on the board, will you go from 18 directors to 3?
Yeah.
And so people are very frightened of the assessment process.
Right.
And so your job is to assure people that it's to get the best out of you.
Yeah. One or two other topics that are related here, and just it's global. It's an overarching concept, but sometimes you're in a crisis. You mentioned a capital campaign or something's not working. I worked on a board where we went from over 40 board members down to about 6. Mm-hmm. We were in a financial crisis.
I remember.
It was the best thing that ever happened to the organization, but it needed to happen.
Yeah. And
that was a reality. Another topic I want to touch on here that relates to assessment. We kind of danced around it and said the purpose of an assessment is not to move a non-performer out, but is in fact there a time to deal with issues of non-performance?
Absolutely. And what makes it so difficult is whether you're in Boise, Idaho, or Manhattan, you have conflicts where your brother-in-law is on the board, your banker's on the board, somebody you know well, someone you want to know, and to be able to tell them, you've missed 6 meetings this year.
Absolutely. So you're talking about something simple like attendance or
Absolutely.
whatever.
Something really...
Right. And there can be other extremes where, look, somebody's got a bona fide conflict of interest and nobody's talking about it. And you know it and everybody knows it, but nobody wants to deal with it because they're the biggest donor or they're the most powerful person in town or whatever else. So classic example. And so the question becomes, if you have issues of misconduct or perceived misconduct, you have to find out ways to deal with it. Sometimes a board evaluation is a good way to deal with that, but a lot of times it's a lot better just to go straight at the issue. And I would just simply add, you have to really think this through. When you talk about director misconduct, what do you mean? Is the issue you have the most courageous person in the room that's speaking the truth? Or the issue is you have somebody who's really hindering conversations, hindering operations, like your conversation with the person on the orphanage? Do you have someone that's just got plain old-fashioned disruptive behavior? Or are they doing something like going outside of the boardroom and maybe they're not violating confidentiality, but they're speaking on behalf of the board without the overall board's approval? There's a lot of things that you can get into in this technical aspect. So the threshold issue when you're thinking about an evaluation is, why do we want to do it? And are we really dealing with the individual problem here? Or are we looking at enhancing the overall performance of the board? So with that, Carol, what else can you tell us to close up the day on board evaluations and board assessments? Give us a closing thought, because you've done a beautiful job here.
The final thought is always praise in public.
Right.
And whenever possible, discuss difficult issues, especially when they have to do with an individual in private.
Are we talking about raising children, or are we talking about
marriage?
Oh.
All of it.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. And we're talking about director assessment and the board evaluations, and those are wise words.
Don't forget to praise good behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you. Great to be with you. And our thanks to the folks at BoardPack.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you again to Tom and Carol for your wonderful insight today. If you have any questions or comments for today's speakers, their contact information is on the screen. If you have interest in learning more about BoardPack, please send us an email, sales@boardpack.com.